Well, this is the Dean Abbott podcast, and today my guest is Jeffrey Bilbro, who is professor of English at Grove City College and author of, most recently, Exile's Journey, a new collection of poems. How's it going, Jeffrey? Do you prefer Jeffrey or Jeff?
Oh, Jeff is fine. But yeah, it's going well. Thanks for having me on, Dean.
Yeah, and you said the weather in Western Pennsylvania is inhospitable.
It's been quite chilly this week. But I got out ice fishing yesterday with a friend of mine. So, if it's cold and it makes ice, then you find ways to enjoy the ice.
And did you catch anything?
Yeah, I caught some small crappies, but nothing huge.
I see. Okay. And you and I have, or at least I've kind of seen you around on Twitter for years. I think you're probably one of my early follows. How is that going for you?
Twitter in particular?
Oh, yeah. So I don't know what other social media you use, but
yeah, that's the only one I use, and I'm back and forth with how much I use it. Yeah, I mean, I think all these tools have to be kind of used against their grain, I guess. A while back at Front Porch Republic, this website I edit, we ran a symposium on, how could localists or people of sort of people who prioritize embodied community, how might they use social media well? And some people said you can't, you just get off. And others of us said, well, maybe there's ways that it can be kind of marginal to our lives, but nonetheless play a role in encouraging others and spreading kind of counter-currents of truth and goodness and beauty. But I think it's something I always have to evaluate. Am I being shaped by the kind of norms of Twitter more than I am able to push back and offer some light and some kind of pointers to more substantive ideas and discourse? And I think one of the ways that my Twitter rhythm, I think, is enabled is by taking a month or so off every summer and kind of resetting. I found that really helpful for a recalibration and assessing. But yeah, I still think in general that I benefit from the interactions on Twitter and trying to listen into what thoughtful people are saying. And so it's a not imperfect tool, but I think it can be used well.
What are the norms of Twitter that are shaping you?
The things I worry about in particular are the tendency to sort of be reactive and I don't have anything. I'm just sort of, bored, apathetic. Give me something to be angry about. And people just sort of post in response to that. I think that's unhealthy. And then the tendency, I suppose, because it's not quite like it used to be, obviously, because you can have longer posts now. But the tendency is still to be very short. And I think Alan Jacobs, in an earlier essay, talks about Twitter and media like that being good for publishing, but not good for thinking with. So if you've done some substantive thought and you want to point people to that, then I think social media can be effective in that. But if you're doing your thinking on Twitter, then I think it's less healthy.
Tell me what you mean by prioritizing embodied community.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I mean, I think in many ways our culture has drawn our attention away from the places that we live and the people that we share them with and the other creatures we share them with. And, I think Christians in particular have an obligation to understand ourselves as members of the body of Christ, as members of a particular instantiation and placed body. And so as much as possible, I want to belong first and foremost to where I am, and then let my other relationships be shaped by those commitments. So it can take a lot of different forms, but I think in general, that's a necessary kind of counter pressure to resist some of the deracinating and abstracting tendencies of our kind of digitally driven culture.
But why is that important?
Because we're embodied creatures. We're embodied people, and our status as sort of healthy creatures. Health depends upon acknowledging and inhabiting our embodiment rather than being frustrated by its limitations.
What if I don't like the people around me?
Which is a guarantee, right?
What if I don't like any of the people around me?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things that actually came up in that forum we did with on social media, that there's ways in which social media and the internet can actually help us find, to use Burke's phrase, little platoons, right? People that can encourage us. And I think that's true. But I hope that our interactions there with like-minded people gives us the virtues needed to redemptively minister to the people that God has placed around us, because those are the people that we can influence usually most, that we're obligated to love. I mean, I think of Augustine's quote that Christians are called to love everybody, but most especially those who are near us. Mm-hmm. And as you point out, that's often the hardest people to love as well, because we know them the best and we are aggravated by them the most.
Let me play devil's advocate here for just a moment. There's this writer, you may have heard of him, named Wendell Berry, who's a kind of a famous localist.
Yeah.
I'm being ironic because
I know. Yeah.
Working with Wendell's material is a big part of your life, isn't it?
Yep.
Yeah. Say just a little bit about that, if you would, so people kind of know what you do with that.
Yeah. I mean, I stumbled across Wendell Berry when I was an undergrad and read him pretty voraciously, and felt like he was sort of putting together a lot of the pieces that I've been thinking about, but connecting them in ways that I hadn't thought about yet. In terms of, caring for creation, a theology that treats community and the land as important. Someone who cares about literature like I do, but also for how it helps us to live better, more virtuous lives, not just as kind of an abstract specialty. So yeah, since then I've written quite a bit about his kind of particular Christian care for creation, his views on education, the reasons that he writes in different genres, his thinking on AI, or at least sort of the machine mentality that I think leads into our current obsession with AI. So yeah, I think Wendell Berry is a good guy to spend some time and thought with and being provoked by.
Well, just so you know where I'm coming from as I play devil's advocate.
Yeah.
I started reading Wendell when I was a late teenager, like in 1989, when no one had heard of him.
Yeah, right? You were ahead of the curve.
Yes. He really came into prominence somewhere around 2011 or 2012 is where, when he was 78 years old was when I feel like he really kind of became a mainstream figure. But I found and read his book called Recollected Essays in the late 80s, maybe 1990. But I came to him by way of Edward Abbey, and who often wrote about Wendell Berry.
Yep.
And at that point, I was, like I said, 19-year-old boy, and Edward Abbey's desire to blow things up really appealed to me. His sort of wild radicalism about everything was appealing to me, in part because as a 19-year-old boy, I had no subtle categories in my own mind. And you can appreciate Abbey without having to have subtle categories.
Yep.
He's that kind of. I mean, part of his power is the destruction of nuances. And so I kind of came to Wendell Berry and was a little bit surprised that I'm reading someone who has some of the same ideas, but it's much calmer than Edward Abbey.
Yeah.
So here is my question. If we take, say, a novel like Jayber Crow about this barber in some little town. Oh, I'm in Kentucky, by the way. So some little town not far from here, who lives his life in this community, finds his life really starts to fall apart when he gets a car because now he can drive to places and get in trouble. And kind of ends with this beatific moment when this woman whom he loved dies. He kind of has like a vision of ultimate reality or something.
Yeah.
Here's my thought about that. When Jayber Crow is just Wendell Berry. And I love Jayber Crow, and I particularly loved Hannah Coulter. But one of the things I noticed about those novels is that there are moments where the character will stop the narrative to sort of give you a mini essay from Wendell Berry and sort of philosophize along the lines. Yep. And my question is, isn't it easier for people like Wendell Berry, maybe people like you and I, who have the capacity to look beyond the mundane, quotidian events of small town, rural community life, to see some meaning behind there? Isn't that easier for us to do that, to live in those places in a way that is satisfying than it would be for people who cannot do that? And that's why Jayber Crow can do it. Whereas most people in these terms have to move to Louisville and get a job.
Yeah, I think that's right. And, Berry has written about how it was necessary for him to leave Port Royal, to go to Stanford, go to New York, go to Europe, in order to then be able to return to Kentucky and choose that place, right? And I think your examples, with Jayber and Hannah, both of them had some experience of the world beyond, especially Jayber. And both of them, I think, also are well-read, so imaginatively they have a sense of the world outside their place. And I think you're right, that is crucial. Like, they're able to better inhabit their place because they've listened to and thought about people in other places. There's a way that you can be stuck in a place and be bitter and be resentful and, not move, but not really be there either. So I think it's Wendell's sort of, I suppose, vision of inhabiting a place well includes this imaginative capacity that is fed from other places. I think it's the Irish poet Patrick Kavanagh who makes this distinction between the parochial and the provincial. And he says, the provincial is somebody who's stuck in a place and is all kind of feels inferior because probably better things are happening in London or New York City. And, this person always wants to get out and get away. And the parochial mind is happy to learn from other places and is interested in what's going on elsewhere, but not in a kind of bitter or a sense of not with a sense of inferiority. And so the parochial mind thinks, life here is good. Where I am is as good as it gets. It's broken and messed up just like every other place, but it's also contains glimpses of the Creator's love. And so the parochial can inhabit his or her place well. And I think that's maybe your question and these sorts of distinctions are helpful in correcting maybe simplistic or naive notions of being a localist that would just equate not moving with virtue or something.
Mm-hmm. That was actually my next question was what's the difference between being a localist and being just plain provincial?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Because clearly there is a difference, right?
Mm-hmm.
Clearly there's a lot of people who are in a place, but they don't love the place. And I think sometimes, as I've said, sometimes it helps actually to leave a place in order to appreciate it. But hopefully a localist is somebody who wants to be a student of the place where they live and seeks to tend the kingdom of God as it's inaugurated there. Doesn't pretend that their place is flawless, but recognizes that they have an obligation to serve the common good of that place, of its people and its creatures, and thinks that's kind of their primary responsibility, and that distant places, our obligations there might be real as well, but maybe secondary.
Now, I'm from a smaller town in Indiana, not a village. I'm from a town of about 20,000 people. A lot, very blue collar. There aren't many localists there.
Yeah.
And the sort of normal blue collar, very small town Hoosier has never read Wendell Berry, never heard of Wendell Berry, never heard of localism. And that person's life is essentially devoted, if you're lucky, to their family, maybe to something going on at church, maybe not. Essentially, their life is devoted to making sure they have enough money to secure themselves and then spending that money on fun things. This has been the way it has been in my hometown my whole life. So it seems to me, so here's the question for you. Isn't localism a philosophy that is actually foreign to places like my hometown in Indiana, where no one thinks this way? In fact, they don't even necessarily recognize that they are in a place. And that isn't it the case that, again, playing devil's advocate, isn't it the case that localism can, in a way, be kind of imposed on actual natives of a place who themselves didn't come up with it?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, sure. I think localism, like any philosophy, can become a kind of ideology, with all the rigidity that implies. But I think, in many ways, the sort of gift of localism is giving people, like you described, which I can relate with, giving those kinds of people permission to love their place because they've been told, like the sort of cultural narrative is, your place doesn't matter, your life sucks. If you can make sure your kids leave this place or have a better life than you, then that's about what you can aspire to. Mm-hmm. And I think that narrative has sort of sunk its teeth deeply into the imaginations of many Americans, and it too is a foreign import that can condition people to not see the goods that maybe are accessible or available right before them. So, yeah, I think localism, especially in the American context, is definitely a minority position. And it's not the case that like small towns are sort of inherently vibrant and self-aware about their own goodness, right? I mean, I think many small places or rural places or small towns feel very beset by economic forces and feel inferior for many real, legitimate reasons. So, yeah, I think localism. I think you're right to see it in many ways as something that has to be brought in or sort of imaginatively developed rather than just springing up from the grassroots.
Mm-hmm. It requires a kind of elite.
Yeah.
That brings me to well, actually, I have three questions in mind. When I think of highly self-aware small communities, I think of places that I have visited in, say, Oregon, maybe some places I visited in Vermont, definitely in Massachusetts. Ipswich, Massachusetts, a small community, very self-aware, trying to remain what it is. Why are the most self-aware, self-preserving small communities always in blue places? And places that are very small communities in very red places like Indiana don't have that level or have not typically had that level of self-awareness. And I think that may be changing. But why is that, do you think?
Yeah, I'm not sure I totally buy your premise, although I do recognize what the sort of the phenomenon you're talking about. But the place I grew up in Western Washington, which is outside of Seattle, so very blue. Mm-hmm. But I also spent part of my youth in a small rural community in Central Washington, very red, mm-hmm. and very coherent. But it was a kind of unique place, kind of cut off from the world, so people needed each other. Mm-hmm. I think that's part of it. And now where I'm in Grove City now, which is a relatively small town. And for a variety of reasons, I think partly because of the college, partly because of some kind of niche manufacturing here, and partly for, kind of hard to identify causes. Like this community has a sense of place and identity and culture that towns, 15 minutes from here do not. So like I think many towns in Western PA would fit what you're describing, but some of us, some of these towns still have a sense of like, oh, this is a place that I would want to live, and I'm glad to be here. So, yeah, I think there is probably an element of educational level. I think having a broadly educated community helps. And I think some places like in Massachusetts and Vermont, it helps if you got a lot of money.
That's what I was. I was going to float the idea that the important distinction is my hometown is poor and Massachusetts is rich.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you're in a place where there's just no economic opportunity, it's hard to be grateful for it. It's hard to imagine wanting your kids to grow up there. It's hard to have a sense of identity. So, that's in many ways the great tragedy of the last, I don't know how many decades in American politics and economics, where many small towns have, where the economic opportunities in many small towns have shrunk. And that just creates this sense of embattlement, and understandably so, right? People want to leave. So I think, the economics play a huge role in a place's valuation of itself.
When I was a kid, everybody worked at Chrysler in my town. Okay, the Chrysler plant. Most people did. And I grew up thinking that what it meant to be a rich person was to be a teacher, a lawyer, or a dentist, because these were the only professional people I knew, right? Every Christmas, the UAW would rent out our single theater in town and host a big event where if you were the son or daughter of a UAW worker, you could come to the theater and see Santa Claus and get a little gift bag and see Christmas movies. And I think back to, and I think about, we had a local newspaper that was very vibrant. And even when I was 11 and 12, I loved reading the newspaper. I think I was the only sixth grader whose favorite writer at that time was Russell Baker, the great Pulitzer Prize winning newspaper columnist. I always loved when Russell Baker's column would come out. And we had a radio station that was local and that we would listen to every morning that would tell us that where the announcer would read today's school lunch menu. So we would know what we were having for lunch that day because they broadcast it on WCTW. Yeah. And I have memories of growing up there where this was before the internet. Some of my memories are from before there was really cable television. And the town was spontaneously more like what you are describing.
Yeah.
Because nobody even, I mean, who knows? Wendell Berry may not have even thought of localism by that point. He was maybe still traveling. But the town was spontaneously and naively localist.
Yeah. And
then throughout the 80s, the 90s, and since, it was destroyed by globalism.
Yep.
And I suspect, and now I think it is on the brink of a kind of reemergence with some things that are going on there that are sort of demanding that it become a different kind of place, where in 1980 it was naively and organically this sort of almost self-contained community. And now I think people like you or Wendell Berry have to have these ideas imported there again. And I think some people have picked up some frame of that.
Yeah.
But when you apply these things to real communities, it seems to me that it does demand a move from a kind of naivete and spontaneous community development to something much more intentional if you want to preserve these things in the real world.
Yeah, especially in the real world as it has become globalized and digitized, right? So maybe these things were much easier to build in a naive sense when the local people, their attention, their money, their concerns were directed locally. But now, our entertainment is piped in. Everyone's got access to the globe in their pocket. And of course, it's not just the attentional economy, it's the real economy too, that is global. And so if you want to recover something, some kind of sense of place, it's going to look different. It's going to take more effort, to foster that. I think the way you're describing it reminds me too of Ricoeur's notion of like a second naivete. You can't reclaim childhood innocence once you've grown up and lost that. You can't kind of reclaim that simple faith. But you can go through doubts and go through questioning and then come back to a kind of second naivete. And I think that's what's happening in many places as people are thinking about the trade-offs that they've been forced to make and wondering how can I recover a meaningful life? This is think about all the ways that the anxious generation or these other critiques of social media and smartphone life have made people lonely and isolated. So I think there's a hunger for a recovery of a sense of place and embodied community, and that's maybe part of what's feeding these efforts to revive place, a sense of place in many places that have been neglected for decades.
I bring up the newspaper, my hometown newspaper, because it's essentially dead now. And it's owned by McClatchy or one of these big companies that just buys up papers and milks them for money until they can't go anymore. And it seems to me that the newspaper, what nobody knew at the time, perhaps this is part of the first naivete, was that the newspaper was actually very important because it was the chief way that our community reflected itself to itself.
Yep.
But also, it was, even though journalism then and for most of its existence was a kind of blue-collar job, it still required through the curation of an editor or a series of editors, and through the demands that certain traditions be met, like whatever, the traditions of journalistic practice, it did bring a kind of, it was actually almost, instead of a direct reflection, it was like a refraction of our community through an elite who wrote and managed and selected content for the newspaper. And what we now have instead is a more direct reflection of our community, which is the Facebook group where everybody yells at each other.
Right.
And so the interposing of that elite through what was a non-democratic media mechanism elevated I think our community's image.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the newspaper was all important. And when it goes, in a sense, your community's self-understanding goes.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, there's been so much written about the decline of local news and what that does to the local economy, to the local sense of a place and its self-awareness, as you've been saying. And there's a lot of people trying to experiment with new models, whether it's nonprofit or citizen journalism or grant funding, or I don't know. But it's tough because the whole, advertising economy shifted, and what papers are left are, as you say, rightly, a sort of shell of themselves that are just concerned with making somebody somewhere else a lot of money. So I think it's, again, we didn't realize what we had until we lost it, and the importance that newspapers played in sustaining a sense of community is best appreciated, tragically, when they're gone.
Mm-hmm. What's the difference between reading on Twitter for an hour in the evening and reading Dante? Why is one disembodying and the other is not?
It's interesting you should ask that, because I am just finishing up a book review of a book about early modern readers, including Dante and some of the other figures in the Italian Renaissance. And I think, for some of them, you can see the kind of disembodying and uprooting that we associate with social media. You can see that with their practices of reading, how they would withdraw from their places. Petrarch, or maybe it's Montaigne, says that he prefers books to people because they don't have bad breath. If you don't want to talk, if your friend bores you, you can just, you can put the book down and turn to a different book, whereas you can't do that with a real friend. So in some ways, books are more convenient than persons. So I do think, reading itself can have at least, some kinds of negative effects. But yeah, I do think in general, Twitter sort of amplifies those tendencies, and or social media in general, I guess, and promises to give us kind of the benefits of community without its obligations or costs. We can feel connected, but we don't have to think deeply or listen to a boring person or kind of work through a sustained thought. But of course, if you don't have the pains of community, then the pleasures and rewards and joys are also simulacra, attenuated, shallow. So the benefits with other costs turns out to be not the benefits either.
Do you think with books it's different?
I mean, again, I think books are not perfect. I think you can have, but I think books are less. It's less. It's the temptations are different because books do demand more from us than digital reading, and when we meet those demands, the likelihood anyway is that we're putting more into the relationship. We're doing more of the work, and so in that sense, anyway, we can reap the intellectual rewards of sustained attention, of following somebody else's train of thought closely. And hopefully, if we can learn to befriend books well, then we can kind of hone the skills needed to befriend people well as well. I think that's the ideal trajectory.
Speaking of books, you've written a few. How many have you written now?
I've written several. It depends on if you call. I've co-authored some. I've co-edited some.
Ballpark.
What was that?
Ballpark.
Oh, like 5 to 9.
Okay.
Depending on how you count.
Including most recently Exile's Journey, a collection of poetry.
Yeah.
How did that come about?
I mean, this is my first book of poems. I've written poems since I was a kid. I took classes in college, took classes in grad school, I've taught poetry classes, so I've always sort of written and read poetry on the side. But a few years ago, I guess a year ago maybe, I was emailing with Dan Rattel, who I think you've...
I do. Dan Rattel's been on this program.
Yeah. He's a good guy. And I knew he was part of this little independent press, Anglican press that publishes poetry. Mm-hmm. And so I said, hey, I've got these poems. Would you be interested in them? So often poetry publishing, you got to like pay money to enter a contest to get published. It's kind of a weird racket because more people are interested in writing poems than reading them. So there's no money in publishing poetry books. But Dan was a good editor, and he helped kind of hone these, and I was happy to let them come out into the world under his and the press's kind of guidance. So I kind of was waiting for a institution, a press that would fit and that would be okay with publishing a book that's not going to sell very many copies.
Well, tell me about your approach to poetry.
Yeah, I read a lot of poetry. I think I guess I'll say this. I think reading and then especially writing poetry provides me an opportunity to think about experience, right? To kind of self-reflect on where I am and what I'm thinking in a way that prose doesn't. I read a lot of prose, obviously, and prose is more rationalistic, I'm trying to make an argument. And in poetry, I'm trying to either develop an image or metaphor or play with some sounds, but I'm less trying to here is the point. I know what I want to say, and here's how I'm trying to say it, and more trying to sit with and open up things I don't understand. Experience them more deeply, and so I guess in that sense, poetry doesn't have the point of a poem for me is, does it evoke an experience or a vision or a moment in its complexity, rather than with prose, am I being precise? Have I sort of nailed everything down? And I think both modes are valuable, but I think it's important for my mental, psychological health that I spend time in the poetic mode.
I don't know if you're familiar with the poet Jane Greer.
Yes.
But I interviewed her recently for an upcoming episode of the podcast. And we talked a lot because I also am a poet and have been writing a lot of poems recently. And we talked a lot about the poetic process as being fundamentally about reception.
Yeah.
As opposed to maybe when you're writing an essay, it's the process is less about receiving and more about constructing something.
Yeah.
Find that for yourself?
Yeah, I think so. On the other hand, for me, when I sort of like, I have to intentionally do something with the glimpses that I receive for them to come into a poem, right? Like a poem is sort of a made thing, as its etymology suggests. But yeah, fundamentally, so that caveat aside, I think you're right. That with an essay, I have a lot more control over the process, and I can wrestle it into shape. And sometimes with a poem, I have an inspiration, I work on it, and I kind of get stuck, and it never develops beyond that, right? It's sort of bad poem or half poem. I think that's okay, and I'll try again next week. So for me, that it's the process of listening or attending that sometimes generates a poem that's worth pursuing.
Jane is a committed formalist. And where do you stand on the formalist free verse approach?
Yeah, I'm not. I'm not as virtuosic formally as she is. So I do write sometimes in quatrains that are more or less iambic tetrameter, iambic pentameter, or something. Sometimes I rhyme, but often I'll have like this line has 4 or 5 beats that are stressed, right? And every line has the same amount of stressed beats. So I play a little more loosely with the meter, but it depends. I will write sonnets that are pretty much by the book, but then I'll also write other ones. I enjoy that. I do sometimes find that working within the constraints of a form helps me to say things I otherwise wouldn't say. Like it forces me to be surprised, and I really enjoy that. But I also sometimes write more free verse.
Do you have poets that you particularly like to read?
Yes, many.
Can you tell us the names of some?
Yeah. So I read a lot of Wendell Berry poems, obviously.
Who is a wonderful poet.
Yeah, he is. And then, tell
me the name of a Wendell Berry poem that you like.
Just yesterday, I was talking with some students about one of his Sabbath poems. I think it's 2012. It's the poem from which comes the line, Timbered Choir, which is the collection of one of his collections, the title of one of his Sabbath poetry collections. Beautiful poem with all these different metaphors for what the forests or the trees accomplish, what they are, their nature. And I love the Mad Farmer poems. They're sort of maybe more in the Ed Abbey vein.
Right. Yes. Yes. If you don't mind talking about that for a moment. So the Mad Farmer Liberation Front is an old poem now.
Yeah.
I mean, it's, he probably,
70s.
Yeah, in the 70s.
Yeah.
And you can tell it's an early poem because it is more Edward Abbey-ish, maybe.
Yep.
Some of his other poems are much more lyrical and profound. In the Country of Marriage, I don't know if you know that poem.
Yes.
His poem At a Country Funeral.
Yeah.
Is so deep.
Yeah.
And his little poem that opened the move, I'm sure you are familiar with Look and See.
Yep.
The one about the objective.
Yeah.
That I don't know what that poem is called, but it's very profound.
Yeah.
And then he has a poem that I love. I think it is actually untitled, where he talks about the heaven of my earthly loves and his desire to see his dogs again. And I don't know what that poem is called either, even if it has a title, but it's very profound one.
Yeah. I mean, his range is remarkable. Just those ones. I mean, one of my favorites too is one of the Sabbath poems that's just a meditation on Piero's fresco of the resurrection. So it's an ekphrastic poem. He'll have poems that are written in the voice of fictional characters. So I think his range is remarkable. That you can have the kind of quiet, imagistic lyric poem, or the angry poem, the narrative poem, the theological poem, and that's one of the reasons why I enjoy reading them, because there's that variety built into the collection.
What other poems? What other poets do you like to read?
I'm a big fan of Dana Gioia.
Ah,
Always enjoy rereading his work.
how come? I don't know anything about him really.
Oh, he's one of these kind of new formalist guys, but maybe more on the early part of it. So he was writing formalist poems before it was cool.
Hmm.
And he's also a fascinating person. He was the VP of, I don't
He's
know.
on Twitter, I think.
He is. He is. He was the VP of marketing at like General Foods and was a businessman, but then he wrote poems at night.
Mm.
And eventually was the chairman of the NEA under Bush too.
Mm.
So he's got this, he's got the kind of institutional. He can operate in the business world, or the political world, but he also just has this remarkable sensibility and beautiful language, beautiful sounds, and a kind of quiet wisdom.
Mm-hmm.
And he's a he grew up blue collar in an immigrant working class neighborhood in California, so he has a lot of tangible poems about working people like his ancestors or his family members. So they're not kind of lofty or abstract or overly intellectualized. And some of my favorite poems by him are about his grappling with the loss of his first son, I think when he was only 2 months old or something, to SIDS, and just kind of processing the grief and asking God questions, and just beautiful ways to turn that horrible experience into art that helps him and others, I think, live well in the wake of tragedy.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else?
I like A.E. Stallings. She's a American poet, but she lives in Greece. She's another formalist. I also, those are living ones. I also like Richard Wilbur.
Mm-hmm. Is Richard Wilbur still alive?
No, he passed away maybe 10 years ago or so, maybe more. I don't know.
Right.
I've been on an Auden kick recently, just kind of reading through Auden's collected poems.
Of course. Uh-huh.
So, and I also like, I get the chance to teach Dante and Milton regularly, and those,
You're okay.
Yeah, they're okay. They always merit rereading. It's pretty remarkable.
It's interesting as we speak. On my left hand here on my desk, I have the collected poems of R.S. Thomas. Are you familiar?
Oh, yeah.
Anglican church clergyman in Wales, who was nominated for the Pulitzer in 1996. Yep. Wonderful poems.
Yeah.
It helps if you know a little Welsh.
I know.
But just his use of his phrasing and his images are just so moving.
Yeah.
And his love for the poor people of Wales comes through but
also not at all sentimental, right?
Yes, that's very interesting. Deeply Christian poems that have no feeling of niceness about them.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah, a couple of years ago, I was going to go, actually in 2020, I was going to go to Wales for a conference on Windleberry. And so I read all of R.S. Thomas, I read his autobiography, and wrote a long essay on him.
Uh-huh.
Kind of centered around one of his poems. I'm blanking the title, but it's about, I think I first saw it actually in a Malcolm Guite collection or anthology. But it's about this moment of like seeing something beautiful in the field and turning aside, and there's
the bright field.
I think maybe it's just the bright field, yeah. Mm-hmm. And this idea that like so many of his poems, there is a kind of epiphany, but it's not like a movement that leads away from the world. It's a movement that helps kind of turn him deeper into the world. So it's a turning aside, but in order to see more deeply. Mm-hmm. I always enjoy reading Thomas.
So that's on my left hand. On my right hand is this my new copy of Writing the Australian.
Oh yeah,
William Stafford, which was his first book on writing, because he taught for decades writing at Lewis and Clark.
Yep.
And William Stafford is a kind of more than a poet to me, kind of a spiritual mentor in a way, given the way that his very plain spoken, very, very gentle poems sort of always point to another world that without ever being kind of on the nose.
Yeah.
And I just adore them. And his probably maybe one of his most famous poems is his poem called "Ask Me." Ask me sometime when the river is ice. Ask me mistakes I have made. And I love this line. Ask me if what I have done is my life. And then he says near the end, the speaker says, you and I can look at the frozen river and know that miles away, the current is there, and that comings and goings hold this stillness exactly before us. And throughout his poems, there's that idea that, okay, it looks frozen, but we know that within this thing, there is a movement. There's like another thing. And that even if you added up everything you ever did, every tiny choice you ever made, it would not equal your life, because your life is more than the sum of its parts.
Yeah.
And so I was so taken to just start writing the Australian Crawl, because right from the beginning, he says, writing poetry is to work as if there is a hidden code inside everyday language. And this is such a theme with him of this sort of hidden, deeper life within life itself. And I really think he's on to something there. And it kind of shapes my sense of formalism and free verse. Is obviously Stafford's a very obviously free verse poet most of the time, and sometimes when I read really formal poems, I feel like it's almost there. And I know that, like you said, formalism is maybe experiencing a comeback, but and maybe it does help poets say things they wouldn't otherwise say. But also, I feel like it can inhibit them as well. And I think Stafford's like an example of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the danger with formalism is you can get a surface right. It can be virtuosic, but in that process, you can miss the river flow underneath, and it feels kind of superficial. So ideally, you get both, and it's all comes together. But I think, there's a reason why poets reacted against the strictures of formalism. And I think Stafford's a good example too, because he probably wrote too many poems. There's some of his poems where I'm like, this doesn't do it for me.
Well, he wrote a poem every day for like 15 years.
I know. It's incredible. So to collected work, I don't know, it's just like overwhelming.
Mm-hmm. That's why there's no collected poems. There's no.
Is there no? Okay.
No.
Well, there you go. But he's one of these people where it seems sometimes like he's just writing prose that's broken to lines. Like, it's so unostentatious, so humble, and yet there is always more going on. Like, there is this depth, and so I think with him, it's very inviting, very welcoming. And then if you sit with it patiently, it's one of his good ones, then the depths expose themselves.
Speaking of his prodigious output, I was watching not long ago an interview with Robert Bly, who, obviously another great well-known American poet who was very close friends with William Stafford, who was talking about Stafford, what happens when you write a poem a day for 50 years. And he said that when someone wanted to publish he called him Bill's first book, they came to him and said, "We liked this poem we saw of yours. Do you have any more?" And he said, and Bill said, "Yeah, here's 100. And then they came back and said, "Well, do you have any more?" And he said, "Yeah, here's 100 more." And Robert Bly said that William Stafford ended up submitting 300 poems for his first book of 50.
Yeah.
That you can do that when you write a poem every day.
That's what an editor is for, help you see the 50 good ones.
Right. Also, on my desk, I also have a copy of How the Light Gets In, a writing of spiritual practice by Pat Schneider. I don't know if you're familiar with Pat Schneider or not. Um, Christian poet who taught writing for years and years in Massachusetts. I don't know a lot about her except all of her poems that I've read are wonderful. Particularly you might look it up. Her poem called "The Patience of Ordinary Things" is a wonderful poem.
Okay.
Do you have a poem you'd like to read for us before we go?
Yeah, should it be one of my poems or somebody else's poem?
Well, you can do both if you want.
Okay.
The internet is large. We don't have a limit.
Well, then let me read a Richard Wilbur poem because I got this out thinking we might talk about poems. So this is one of my favorite Wilbur poems these days, and it's about, I think, in part, but maybe it kind of combines both of these things we've been talking about: the task of poetry to sort of help us name and see our places, but also the need to attend to where we are and not just abstractions. So the title of this one is "Advice to a Prophet." When you come, as you soon must, to the streets of our city, mad-eyed from stating the obvious, not proclaiming our fall, but begging us, in God's name, to have self-pity, spare us all word of the weapons, their force and range, the long numbers that rocket the mind. Our slow, unreckoning hearts will be left behind, unable to fear what is too strange. Nor shall you scare us with talk of the death of the race. How should we dream of this place without us? The sun mere fire, the leaves untroubled about us, a stone look on the stone's face. Speak of the world's own change. Though we cannot conceive of an undreamt thing, we know to our cost how the dreamt cloud crumbles, the vines are blackened by frost, how the view alters. We could believe, if you told us so, that the white-tailed deer will slip into perfect shade, grown perfectly shy, the lark avoid the reaches of our eye, the jack-pine loose its knuckled grip on the cold ledge, and every torrent burn as Xanthus once, its gliding trout stunned in a twinkling. What should we be without the dolphin's ark, the dove's return? These things in which we have seen ourselves and spoken. Ask us, prophet, how we shall call our natures forth when that live tongue is all dispelled, that glass obscured or broken, in which we have said the rose of our love and the clean horse of our courage, in which beheld the singing locust of the soul unshelled, and all we mean or wish to mean. Ask us whether with the wordless rose our hearts shall fail us. Come demanding whether there shall be lofty or long-standing when the bronze annals of the oak tree close.
What would you like to say about that?
Yeah, that maybe what we need to understand our place in our world and the challenges we face is not numbers, statistics, big ideas, big concepts, but renewed attention to the particular natural created things by which we understand ourselves. You know, how can we understand what lofty or long-standing is without an oak tree? And if we want to grapple with our condition and what we need to do, we need to recover a language that's precise and articulate and lively, and can tell the truth about the world. That's a paraphrase, I think, from a line by Wendell Berry in Defense of Literacy. But yeah, I think Wilbur just gets to the sense that poetry can help us hone a more grounded language.
Mm-hmm. Would you like to read one of your own poems?
Sure. Since I went ice fishing yesterday, I'll read one about ice fishing.
Okay, great.
Once you get your hole bored, set your stool and settle down. You must stay. Freed of the choice to try some other spot, you can sit. Anticipate a bluegill's bite. Enjoy the silence of the snow-muffed ice and wait for grace to strike. Patience unfolds, a delicate blossom known only by waiting, watching, luminescent, like the first fish you haul through the hole, its delicate skin reflecting the ice's diamond glint.
Mm-hmm. Is there anything to say about that one?
I don't know. It's not a complicated poem, I suppose. There's some. I think there were some fun word plays in there that I enjoyed working out. But it's really a poem I think about the tension between being bored and being patient, and sometimes the constraints of being limited. You can't move around the lake. I mean, you can, but you got to drill a new hole. Frees you to be in the place, right? If you can't move, then you're free to be there and see what's there and enjoy its wonders.
Clearly, your poem is about evoking that experience.
Yeah.
Very good. Very good. Tell people where they can find out more about you and get your book and all of those things.
Yeah. I have a website, jeffbilbro.com, that has all that info. I update whenever I publish a new essay or anything.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for doing this. It's been a great talk.
Yeah, thanks, Dean. It was fun.
All right. Well, maybe we can do it again sometime.
Good.